Fala pessoal, tudo bem? Antes da gente começar o episódio de hoje, vocês vão perceber que a gente está gravando num lugar diferente. A gente ganhou uma casa agora, a gente ganhou um teto, a gente tem um estúdio na Casa 21, onde a maioria dos podcasts vão ser gravados presencialmente, o que é um espetáculo, é muito bom, mas eu faço a ressalva que a gente está testando o setup e aprendendo a usar enquanto a gente grava esses primeiros episódios. Então, nesses primeiros episódios, talvez dê uma coisinha, uma falhada na câmera, talvez dê um lagzinho em alguma coisa, e faz parte. Acho que a qualidade das conversas já está muito melhor por a gente gravar ao vivo, mas agora tem toda essa curva de aprendizado de aprender a usar o estúdio quando a gente está gravando ao vivo. Então, peço a consideração, a paciência de vocês, mas estamos melhorando para ficar cada vez melhor o conteúdo que a gente produz para vocês. Valeu, gente. Agora o episódio. I use only Twitter Space. I didn't use Clubhouse, but Space, it was like a copycat of Clubhouse, right?
Yeah, Space is basically like like a lot of the early people. So it was like the Clubhouse people. Then they all left because Clubhouse became like total garbage.
Right.
And then they went on Spaces. So a lot of the people who like are on X Spaces now, they like come from that generation of. But then now I think it's been so long. It's been like 4 or 5 years that like there's like all new. I mean, the one I don't even really follow X Spaces that much, but the one guy I know who's always on X Spaces is Fred Krueger.
Yeah.
I feel like that guy's like super new. I feel like he came out like last year.
He came maybe in November, December because of the ETFs. I mean, he was a TradFi guy, a little bit Bitcoiner, like investor in tech. And when the ETFs starting to happen, he say, guys, you are not understanding the size of the change that's going to happen. You guys are all sleeping on the wheel. You are not paying attention. Pay attention. It's going to be huge. Like he was this guy. And since then, he was like, every day, all day, he's in Bitcoin Twitter talking about Bitcoin, basically.
I know. I've seen. And so it's been interesting seeing like the newer, I guess like people who are like kind of in X Spaces and stuff. There's a lot of like crossover. Like Clubhouse at the beginning was like Nick Carter was pretty big on there. Yeah. So that was like how Nick.
Yeah, I remember Nick and I remember American Hodl talking about.
Yeah, American Hodl also was like really, and then I think that's kind of where.
I love this guy, man. I mean, when I was starting to study Bitcoin, I mean, I saw a lot of his takes on Twitter and etc. And it was very important for me to distinguish between Bitcoin and all the other shitcoins, So it was very important for me.
It's a good like learning journey. I think like people sometimes they say like Bitcoiners are toxic, but there is some level of that toxicity that's needed. And we'll talk about that because China actually specifically, I think there's a lot of shitcoiners. But anyways, we'll definitely get into that.
I mean, it's hard because some people are put off by it. But for me, it was the opposite. I mean, I saw, man, I'm curious now. Why these people have so much conviction? I mean, and if you don't care only by the statics, but you try to listen what they are saying, it's very deep. It's not only statics. I mean, the statics, they are not well educated, they're not polite, etc. But look at the meat of what they are talking about. Look at the substance. Very rich what they are always talking about. I mean, for me, Bitcoin Twitter was very important to study Bitcoin, even with all the toxicity and etc.
Yeah, and I mean, some people like don't understand. I think there's like toxicity in the sense of some people interpret like you debating them as toxic, right? Yeah. And I think there's like toxicity in the sense of like if someone's like, hey, I don't want to debate, and you're still harassing them.
Yeah.
Or some people interpret it as like, oh, you're saying things I don't like. Yeah. And then they get hurt. I mean, that's where. The word toxic itself, I think, is like unhelpful in some respects.
Definitely.
But I do think like there are definitely like I would say like hostilities between different, obviously like Ripple people and like whatever.
Even between Bitcoiners. I mean, Bitcoiners hate every tribe, even other Bitcoiners. I mean, there's no consensus in the view.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you can pick any topic and people will have very different views, right? Like, for example, like, do you believe in ordinals? Do you believe in, you know, how L2s, do you believe in like ossification, or like, you know, some of the stuff with like I respect what Fred is doing, but it's very obvious to me that Fred is not a cypherpunk, and that's like its own different thing.
Definitely.
Yeah, so there's like, you know, different tribes, and then, you know, the ETF kind of people, they get very mad at the cypherpunks because they're like, oh, like a samurai, people getting arrested, that's such a bad look for Bitcoin, you know, and like, and then the cypherpunks get mad because they're just like, oh, all you care about is pumping your bags and stuff like that.
And then people get mad with Michael Saylor because he say that, oh, self-custody maybe is not for everyone, thinking that Michael Saylor is not talking with me, he's not talking with you, he's talking with the person that have 100 million, you know, big money of institutional money. So he's not, and people get confused with different people talking to different audience, and they think it's all together. I mean,
I know, so it's like, you know, the Simpsons meme, the one where it's like, you know, you Bitcoiners sure are contentious people, like you have an enemy for life. I feel like that's also kind of Bitcoin.
What's the name? Willie the guy.
Willie, exactly. So it's like, and I mean, it's everybody has. The other thing is like everybody has beef with each other. And other, not even in ideological, but sometimes there's another thing that happens. So I have the blessed opportunity to be able to like look over all this, but without necessarily participating in it so far. Meaning that I don't work for, you know, any of the companies directly and stuff like that. So, but it's just fun to watch kind of like, you know, like for example, like, well, fun is one word, but like, you know, there's people who are doing like open source, like firmware for signing, right? Like self-signers and stuff like that, right? Hardware, like, what is it called? Seed signer. Right? And stuff like that. And then you have people who are like, you know, MBK and like whatever, who are like all big proponents of the community, but they have their own interests, right? Like they need to, you know, and then now it's like kind of like even the Nostr clients, I think some of them like fight a little bit, you know, like I pretty close to with Will, who created Damus. And then I think you're getting all the juicy stuff, by the way, but you know, I think there's not like drama, but like there's some little things that go on between like them and like Primal and stuff like that. So it's like,
I mean, I use both, but the
Egos. I mean, the Egos. I don't actually use neither because, well, I use Primal, but I use more like Amethyst because I don't have iPhone.
Oh, right.
But, yeah.
So, talk a little bit about yourself. I mean, we already started, but who is Roger?
Wait, did this all get recorded?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so. Isn't tá gravando?
Actually,
should we get started? Like, where are we? Are we
10
starting?
minutes ago.
Oh, we started 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, definitely.
I said. All right, well, I mean, feel free to keep however much you want in there.
No, it's good. Like, in the beginning, people don't realize that it's recording, so it's more spontaneous. I mean,
but yeah, we can get started. We already were started, but we can get started. So yeah, happy to talk a little bit about myself, or
please.
So I'm Roger. I since 2014 have been writing about Bitcoin. Started writing about Bitcoin with TechCrunch and VentureBeat, like traditional kind of tech outlets.
But before that, man, 2014 you find out Bitcoin. What happened before? What did you study? Where did you grow up? I mean, who is Roger?
Oh, you want the full story?
Before Bitcoin, before Bitcoin, who are you?
No one. No. You know, I went to McGill to study economics, and I got pretty involved with the Montreal startup scene. So it was pretty interesting because the Montreal startup scene, I didn't know this, but it was going to become kind of like a Bitcoin hub. Like the Bitcoin Embassy was started fairly early, as 2012, 2013. Then I had a few friends who were kind of like working in the space. I actually met Adam Back, but like not met. Like he was like at one of the co-working houses in Montreal because they co-founded Blockstream there way back in the day.
Oh, I didn't know that Blockstream was Canadian and non-American. Is it Canadian?
Well, I don't actually really know. They have an office in Victoria, Canada.
Right.
I don't really know like the legal status per se, 100%. But I do know one of the co-founders originally is a fairly prominent Montreal startup guy. This guy called Austin something, his last name. And so the whole team was in, which is like kind of the co-working space in Montreal at the time, Notman House. So I did economics. I was trying to, I guess like at the time, I didn't really know what I was going to do. So I got really, really attracted to like startups,
Right.
Growing startups and things like that. So it's a whole separate thing, but that's a whole other life I pursued. But how I started to get into Bitcoin was when I started learning about economics. That was after the 2008, 2009 great financial crisis. And, you know, economists, we were still trying to figure out, I mean, I don't even think I'm an economist these days, or if I am an economist, I'm way out of the mainstream. But there was a lot of problems. There was a lot of shit going wrong at the time. It was like terrible. And I remember just like so many instances of things getting rigged. So for example, there was LIBOR, which is like the London Inter-Offering Bank Rate. That was kind of rigged by private banks. It's supposed to be a reference rate for the rest of the world to understand how to price debt. But it was kind of rigged by private English banks in order to suit their interests. And so you started seeing all this. You saw the bailouts. You saw like how like the banks were made whole, but not necessarily the people, right? Mm-hmm. So all very powerful things. And I think that kind of led me down the beginning of this rabbit hole of like, what is Bitcoin? How can Bitcoin be useful? But yeah, I mean, otherwise, you know, who's Roger? I don't know. Really like to party back then. University student, typical. Grew up in Canada, but I was born in China, so I would go back and forth.
Family in China yet, or all your family came into Canada?
Don't love talking about the specifics, but I will say that most of my family is in China. Yeah.
Right.
And so I would go back and forth. I spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong because back in the time I would work and then I would need to use Google. And it's just like super annoying to like work through a VPN in China. Like I just can't like describe the experience. Like the internet's super slow. It's super crappy. Like it might go down at any time on you. So I would go out to Hong Kong and work there for like a few weeks at a time. So yeah, that's kind of like a little bit about me. And yeah, since 2014, I've been writing about Bitcoin. Then I decided to combine, I also wrote about China quite a bit. I covered the Hong Kong protests for some of the Canadian newspapers. I wrote for, at one point, Hong Kong Free Press, a couple of other places, all things that are not super encouraged by the Hong Kong authorities these days. Yeah, I decided to combine the two kind of passions. We were talking a little bit about Clubhouse. I don't know how much of that will make it to this final cut, but
everything, man.
Everything.
We don't censor here.
You got it. Should have been talking about like my all of my dirty secrets, all of my skeletons. Get them all out.
What's your seed, man?
What's my seed? You know what? I write it on the palm of my hand. It's just like kind of the easiest way to remember, you know? I was part of Clubhouse, and we actually ran so I was kind of part of the Bitcoin rooms, but I also ran this like China-focused room called Tiansha. I was co-founded with like another individual called Nicholas, and we basically had English language rooms. We sometimes translated them to Cantonese and Mandarin about China, and so we had speakers like Melissa Chan, who was one of the first journalists to get kicked out of China from Al Jazeera, but also historians and academics and everything like that. And I decided sometime in like 2022, some people reached out to me because I've been writing about the digital yuan for Forbes since like 2019, I would say. And a few people asked me like, hey, do you want to like interview on our podcast? Like The Spectator reached out, but then it never really ended up happening.
Right.
But then it planted the seed in my head. I'm like, I'm already like kind of writing about these topics anyways. Why don't I try? I wanted to learn as much as possible about Bitcoin in China as well. Why don't I try to write a book about this? And so it took 2 years. Went through the editing process.
This is the book, right?
That's the book, yeah.
Perfect.
Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? It's available in Brazil in ebook form. Although only in English, not in Portuguese. This took, like 2 years to get the manuscript together. And then the editing process, publishing process was actually quite smooth, working with Bitcoin Magazine. It's been a labor of love. I'm still doing research on a lot of different threads. The more I try to dig into China and Bitcoin, the more there's like more and more threads that come out. There's just like more and more things. And so you're always trying to tackle the next thing. And so I'm still actively researching a few things. But in general, the book is out. It's available in Brazil in ebook form. It's And it was, for me, like such a great way to like just learn and crystallize all these insights, and then also just to like bring together all these things. And I think I like developed a thesis and a strong point of view through writing the book, because it really like put a task of like condensing everything together.
Yeah, I mean, the process of writing a book is very dense. I mean, I already wrote a PhD, that's sort of a book, and I already wrote a book about Bitcoin here in Portuguese in Brazil. So
cool.
So I understand you. So my first question about the book is about that, like how you frame your work. I mean, because you could pull any thread you wanted. You could, I mean, when you start the book, you are with a blank page, right? So you can choose which direction are you going to go. What was your thinking when you start to write the book?
Yeah, the beginning, I mean, you probably know this because you've written a book as well. The beginning of a book is a total mess. Like, you're just kind of like putting your thoughts on. I had this loose idea that it would be chronological. You know, start from the beginning, go to the end. One of the things that's different about the book, a little bit compared to other Bitcoin books, is it starts earlier, actually much earlier, in the earliest parts of Chinese history. Because one of the parts I wanted to do with the book is to talk about Chinese history to Bitcoiners. Yeah. And to make people understand, like, you know, why Bitcoin had such resonance with China. Because the thing is, in order for you to understand that, you have to understand more than just Bitcoin. You have to understand the unique position of Chinese kind of history, where we are right now in Chinese economics, how we got there. So I always had that loose chronological thought. It took a lot of structural editing. Shout out to Jason Steinhauer, who helped me out a lot with this, just out there. Get a really good like a narrative editor, get a really good structural editor if you ever want to write a book, just FYI, just free unsolicited advice if anybody wants it. And through that, what that then became with the book is I think it became kind of three parts. One was this idea of like teaching enough Chinese history so that Bitcoiners can understand why Bitcoin matured. You know, why is it that there were so many mining companies that came out of China? Why is so many of the world's largest exchanges come from China, right?
And when you say China history, you are meaning like from 2,000 years ago or from 50 years ago? Like what part of China history are we talking about?
Yeah, there's some of, well, yeah, people get me on this all the time because the cover of the book is obviously Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And does Mao play a role? And of course Mao plays a role because, you know, there is Chinese history that flows through that period and through his period. And I'll at the end of this answer, I'll address Would Mao actually hold Bitcoin? Because that's a lot of people ask me. But the book starts really early into Chinese history because China is the first country where paper money and credit money really came into being. There was like Fei Qian, which was which is basically credit money as early as like the years like 800, 900 or thereabouts, right? And so throughout Chinese history, you see the inflationary cycles. I think in the United States and in Canada, sometimes it's hard to see all the consequences. But in China, we've seen, for example, like the Yuan dynasty, which was founded by the Mongols, and such a big empire. It spanned all the way from, you know, the eastern reaches of Europe all the way down to China, right? Throughout Eurasia. One of the first, like, true, what they call, you know, they say Pax Romana for the Roman peace, Pax Mongolica, 100-year or 200 years of like intercontinental country trade. But some of that was shattered because the Yuan dynasty let paper money get out of control.
So it's very similar with the process that we here in Brazil heard about from the Romans, that they were a big empire as well, and they lost a lot of their influence because they lost the control of the monetary system. Like they were clipping their coins and etc. This happened also in China history.
Yes, and it's a very important part of understanding the relationship between inflation and people's understanding of money in China, which is very unique. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But the book itself focuses mostly on Deng Xiaoping,
right,
in the 1980s of China, because yes, Mao created the People's Bank of China, Yes, Mao created the yuan, which is a Chinese currency, and his face is the one on the currency itself. So don't get me wrong, Mao's does have a role to play in this history. And another episode of inflation that people don't know as much, at least in the West, is during the nationalist reign of China, when Mao Zedong took over, right? I'm not saying it's the main reason, but there was a lot of inflation. So for example, at one point, I have a photo. There's this girl, and she's holding 444,000 Chinese yuan at the time, or dollars at the time. And that was nationalist currency. And can you guess how much US dollars that was worth when she was holding it?
Since you are asking like that, I will guess $1.
Close, a little bit not as dramatic. It was 10.
Right.
10 US dollars. So, obviously in the West, again, there's Weimar Republic, there's the wheelbarrows of cash. In China, a similar episode happened as well. So Mao's legacy on creating that state does permeate. But the book actually deals more with Deng Xiaoping and what happened, because in order to understand, China and Bitcoin, the fascination, you first have to understand what is even China's economy. And Deng Xiaoping, who is the paramount leader after Mao Zedong, has a lot more to do with that. He said it was glorious to get rich. He said it doesn't matter if it was a black cat or a white cat, so long as it hunted mice, it was a good cat.
Right.
With Mao, remember, if you were a capitalist, what they called a capitalist voter, 走资派, you could have been killed,
right,
or hunted down. And one of the first things Mao did was he did land reforms where a lot of landlords were murdered, basically, right?
And just to contextualize to Brazilians,
yeah,
Mao Zedong was the guy who did the revolution in the 40s, 50s.
49.
Right.
Yeah. And he took over, so the People's Republic of China is based off of, his portrait is the one that hangs. He's a revolutionary. I mean, I think probably what would resonate in South America is him and Che Guevara were quite close.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah. But then what happened with Mao is when he died, he didn't actually control who his heirs were. And so actually the people he tried to punish for being capitalist voters, they basically ended up being China's ruling class. So the book goes into it a lot more. But in the 1980s, you start to see this evolution of a China that gives people more economic liberty. You finally have the ability to make money for yourself, but still wielding tight political control that Bitcoin can contravene. And now going all the way back, would Mao hold Bitcoin? I have to admit, first of all, it's a little bit of a clickbait title.
Definitely.
It's a little provocative.
That's a good title. It's a good title.
I will say one of the things I'm most proud of is there's some Chinese people who see the book and they're scared. And then some people go and they say, I have to buy this.
Yeah.
Because it has. That's been the coolest experience. As to the actual question, I think Mao, the rebel, we just discussed kind of how he won that revolution. I guess if in a South American context, when he was like Che and actually doing revolution in different places, yeah, he probably would have used Bitcoin because, again, the nationalist currency at the time was hyperinflating and it wasn't under his control. But then when they took over power, like with Fidel Castro in Cuba, I think you would have seen something very similar to the way Cuba treated, the currency and private enterprise and capitalism as a whole. Mao was very much like that. Deng, though, is different. Deng Xiaoping is more mixed in that way. He definitely believed for example, one of the first things they did was they allowed people to make private profit in companies of more than 5 people. With Mao, that was forbidden. The other thing is that with Mao actually had price quotas. So there was no inflation because Mao controlled all the prices from the centralized state, used the violence of the state. One of his favorite quotes was, all political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That was Mao Zedong. So if you want a summary of Mao, that was Mao. Deng Xiaoping is a lot more, we should let people earn money, but the party should tightly control what happens with that money. And so that is the China of today.
Perfect. And Deng Xiaoping stay in power between the 80s until the 90s or something like that?
Yeah, he was kind of like an interesting guy. He kind of, in China, there's a tradition of sometimes it's not the emperor that rules. Sometimes it's the Empress Dowager.
Right.
Cixi would be an example from the last dynasty, where it's basically like the emperor is kind of more of a figurehead.
Yeah.
And so Deng Xiaoping was kind of, they call him like the paramount leader of China, basically since he was alive to a certain degree. And that was from, the 80s throughout into the early 90s. But of course, like by the time he was a little bit older, he didn't necessarily have as much power and influence as he did before. But a lot of what happened to China in the 80s, including Tiananmen Square, which I talk about in the book, happened under Deng Xiaoping's watch.
Perfect. And if we pass now to nowadays, I mean, which kind of person is Xi Jinping? He's more related with Mao, with Dao Jinping. Are you able to draw some connections there, or is just another process?
Yeah, Xi Jinping is kind of an interesting person in this regard. So the first thing to know about Xi is he is an unprecedented leader in the system that Deng Xiaoping left. So Deng actually left a system where there were term limits. So you could only serve 2 terms, and Xi is the first leader to break that. So in that sense, since Deng Xiaoping has died, Xi has probably been the most powerful figure. You might even argue he has a chance at being more powerful than Deng Xiaoping.
Right.
As to his ideology, I don't think he's like Mao. Mao is like very violent. Xi is violent in his own way. Don't get me wrong. He's a totalitarian. He's an authoritarian. But he believes in markets.
Perfect.
As tools. Now, they are tools under the control of the party, but he's not someone who will be like, hey, we need... So in China right now, the term they use is common prosperity and high quality economic development. That's kind of like this big theme, right? And in the vein of common prosperity, right, you and your listeners may or may not have heard, but China's economy is not doing that well right now.
Yeah, definitely. Real estate is a bubble and this sort of things, right?
Sure, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But one of the reasons why that's the case is because in the name of common prosperity, China has reined in some of that private enterprise. It's asserted the party over the kind of country, over the private enterprise and companies. So examples of this are like Jack Ma. He criticized the Chinese credit system. He disappeared for a bit, and his company was not allowed to IPO for a while, right? Property managers were given a lot of restrictions in terms of property financing that they're now trying to roll back. Maybe it's a little bit too late. In the name of common prosperity. But Xi is not like Mao in the sense of like Mao would have never believed in any of this.
Yeah.
And Xi is actually moving to a plan where like there are some things that are more market driven. So for example, Chinese state-owned enterprises, some of them floated more publicly, especially the Chinese banks, right, onto stock markets. Global stock markets, onto the Shanghai Composite Exchange and things like that. And then they also have their depository equivalents in the United States, right? The central bank is trying to move itself to be more like the Fed. They're trying to be targeting their interest rate in a way that's more market-driven. So it's like the market kind of follows the signals. These are not Maoist things. Mao would have been terrified of the whole, it's like, this is capitalism in action right now, right? Millions of people died because Mao refused to embrace capitalism and then also persecuted people who he thought were leading that way. So in that way, Xi is not a Maoist. I think Xi is closer to Deng Xiaoping. But two major differences between Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping that people don't talk about as often. One is that Deng Xiaoping lived through Maoism. Like, he lived through the consequences. A lot of Xi's father actually also lived through Maoism. And they went to jail. They were imprisoned by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. So they came at it from having lived this experience of like what power meant. And so Deng Xiaoping, he architected a system where you could only be in power for 10 years at a time. The reason why is explicitly he did not want another Mao. So we see Xi Jinping is the person to undo that system, right? And that's because she has not, I think, lived through, or he might be that ultimate power. Of course, he doesn't think that way, right? But, so that's one main difference. The other difference is Deng Xiaoping was a military veteran of the Long March and commanded the respect of the military. And so even when he was not in power per se, so in China, when you are Xi Jinping, you are the president, you are also the general secretary of the party. The president is actually more of a ceremonial title because obviously the party votes you in, the people don't vote you in. The other title that you have is chairman of the Central Military Commission. That means that you are in charge of China's military. That's actually where power stems from. It's general secretary, you are in charge of the party. President, you're like kind of the ceremonial figurehead of the state. Central Military Commission, you are the head of China's military. Since the days of Mao, whoever has been in charge of the military, there's been a lot of political control, is in charge of the country. In this respect, Deng is different from Xi because Deng fought in wars and understood what wars were like and also commanded the respect of the military regardless of title or not. Xi Jinping, China has not fought a war since 1979, which Deng ironically fought by invading Vietnam.
Right.
And so it's a very, very different China in that respect. But I think Xi is kind of like the natural extension of Deng's ideology, but plus or minus these two things that we mentioned, which is that Deng still thought, not democratically, but still thought that the party needs to rein itself in by replacing who was on top. So Xi does not believe that, obviously, because he's
on top.
He is on top, and he wants to be on top. The other part is Deng, really had military fiat, and this was really important because, for example, in Tiananmen Square, they sent the military in.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think Xi has that same thing. And in China now, you're seeing, for example, corruption scandals. The defense minister had to be put in prison, things like that. The military discipline and control may not be as tight as it is with Deng. But otherwise, it's the same thread. I think Xi is probably a little bit more leaning towards common prosperity, of kind of a nickname for like more state control and intervention. And in the case of the Chinese state, that's party control. But I think that, he's also trying to nail that balance, right? So if he were a Maoist, he would not be like, oh, we should give back to the markets if things are going poorly. He'd be like, no, like we should execute company holders and things like that, right? Like it's a very different kind of conversation. So that's kind of how I think of Xi, more of an extension of Deng, plus or minus those things, two things we discussed.
So you would say that Mao used to control the people by gunfire, by the guns, and Xi tried to control by economic power instead of violence.
Yeah, it's the trick with the Chinese model has been this balance, and I think this is actually, we can get into the Bitcoin element of it. This is where Bitcoin plays like a really, really interesting balance. So China, since Mao's death, so Mao was really about like China is going to become a communist country. We're on our way to doing that. We're organizing ideologically around that, right? So we have communes, people are allocated their food according to how much they work, etc. But there's no private enterprise, there's no private profit. Xi and Deng Xiaoping are a lot more capitalistic, but the trick is the state gives enough freedom so that people can earn money, and the state can earn foreign reserves, and the state can become more powerful and build military capacity and other things without losing control. Because now it's a very different thing. Chinese people today do not aspire to be communist Puritans. They aspire to get rich.
Right.
And it's a very blunt thing to say it in that way. But that's also part of the reason why Bitcoin has a lot of appeal to Chinese people, right? Because you live in a world where if it was still the old China, the communist China, people would probably be persecuted. Like their values would be like questioned if they were looking for Bitcoin. But now we live in a China where to be rich is to be glorious, right? Now the rub is more like if you're rich, are you doing it for the state? Are you doing it for the guojia? Are you doing it for the nation state? Or are you doing it for yourself? And this is where Bitcoin plays an interesting kind of role. I think it goes directly to the heart of the Chinese Communist Party's biggest weakness. Yeah, some people ask me, and maybe I'm asking you to ask me this on my behalf, but like they're like, will Bitcoin change the Chinese government?
But first,
Okay.
would she hold Bitcoin? Because you're clickbaiting with Mao, but now we are talking in China, or in China.
Yeah.
The last 10, 20 years, 10, 12 years, I don't know,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
with Xi. And this is almost the whole history of Bitcoin. So give us this context, like what's happening in China with Bitcoin since, I don't know, since whenever you want to start, to contextualize what's happening in China and Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, would she hold Bitcoin? I think it's actually a much more interesting question. Maybe I should change my title. But so first, like China, Bitcoin, it started really with the miners. China was like a hardware innovation center. You know, Shenzhen is where a lot of smart hardware is produced in the world. And so creating custom mining chips, ASICs that we know today, that is the beginning of kind of China's contribution to the Bitcoin ecosystem.
So it's like 2014,
2011,
2013.
2012.
11, they already
12.
have specific miners. Wow.
Yeah, 2011, 2012. They start really coming out with these like custom chips. People were mining with GPUs as well.
Okay, so you are talking about GPUs, not ASICs.
Yeah, I think the very first, I have the exact date in the book, but I think it's like the very first is 2013 or something like that.
Right.
But there's definitely people who are already, like, so for example, in China, the argument I make is that China is what helped Bitcoin mature. Because at the beginning, you know, the 2009, 2011 phase, like most people were just mining on CPUs, right?
Yeah.
And then it started being people mining on GPUs. And in China, there were people who owned like video game cafes. They just like had a ton of GPUs. And there's also just systematically like a ton of computer chips around in China for a number of different reasons. And so because some of the manufacturing for those chips is also based there and things like that. And so you see the beginnings of that kind of like mining you know, chips and everything like that. And then the question becomes, well, you have all these people who are mining Bitcoin and getting data blocks. So then how do you transact? And at the time, Mt. Gox did not serve Chinese customers. You could not wire Chinese yuan for, you know, for Bitcoin. And so I interviewed Bobby Lee, who co-created China's first Bitcoin exchange, Bitcoin China, BTCC. And he kind of made the point that he was kind of like, you know, like a lot of the early Bitcoiners, they kind of came from the traditional VC kind of like startup route in China. A lot of people based out of Beijing or Shanghai. You know, he mentions, you know, talking to CZ like really early on, and then talking to all the tech elites. And the tech elites in China during 2013, around this time, there was this interesting confluence of like, you start seeing the mining chips. You start seeing people trade with Bitcoin. You start seeing the beginnings of like the ideas of for mining pools, right? Because the mining infrastructure is being built there. And then, you know, with all of these things coming together, and part of the book I talk about like stuff like, you know, on Bitcoin Talk, there's like a few like threads of, what was it called again? Like ASIC miner, and then, you know, Discuss Fish starts coming out and things like that. So there's all these beginnings of like who created the first ASIC mining chip, and that's its own different mystery. The book goes into that a little bit more. But once you have this confluence, you start having the beginnings of this vibrant ecosystem. And actually a Chinese company, Baidu, which is kind of like the Google of China, accepted Bitcoin for one of its cloud computing services really early on. So there was kind of this buzz in the traditional Chinese ecosystem. Bobby described it to me as like, you know, I think in 2012 or something, he had a dinner. He asked like people in tech in China, he was just like, hey, does any of you know Bitcoin? And no one put their hands up. But then like a year later, he did the same thing and everybody put their hands up. So it felt like this like magic kind of year where everything kind of came together. But And now to answer your question, which she hold Bitcoin, that year was also the beginning of the Chinese government paying attention. And so that's when you started seeing the Chinese party state saying things like the banking system should not permit Bitcoin, right? More like regulatory notices and stuff like that. So this is 2013. And then you start seeing, you know, Chinese companies like Baidu stops taking Bitcoin and things like that, kind of like retrenches back. Now we live, the China of today is kind of, when it comes to Bitcoin, is a mix of these two stories. It's these Chinese entrepreneurs who are still building and building with us today, everywhere around the world. I mean, if you go to like, I was in Bitcoin Amsterdam, and you see a lot of entrepreneurs building not only on Bitcoin, Nostr, different places, right? There's a lot of people who still buy Bitcoin. And there's a lot of people involved with Bitcoin still. And, you know, Bitmain, Bitdeer, these are still the titans and giants of manufacturing, you know, ASICs chips, right? But the government has moved in a direction where they have made it very clear that they want to create the digital yuan, which is the world's first, well, not first, but most advanced central bank digital currency. A digital currency controlled by the central bank directly to counter Bitcoin. And you also have the Chinese entrepreneurs still involved, but the Chinese party state is very against. And so they've done a lot of things to make it difficult to buy Bitcoin, to mine Bitcoin in China.
I mean, here in Brazil, at least, I think in America and Europe, we always heard about, oh, China is going to ban mining. China is going to ban mining. And we are used to listen to this like every year. So after a while, we just stopped believing it. And then in 2021, supposedly China really banned mining. What happened differently, or did something happen differently this time around, and what's the rationale behind it?
I'll talk about that. Yeah, it's a big point of confusion for a lot of people. So 2021, there was a number of different things that happened. Just to kind of complete the loop, as early as like 2017, China was banning ICOs and things like that, initial coin offerings and token offerings. So it was already doing some kind of crackdowns on this level. And then in 2019, it started saying that it was probably going to contravene or regulate or ban Bitcoin mining to some extent, right? But there wasn't ever like an official statement or proclamation until 2021. So in 2021, what happened was the most senior member of the Chinese party state, Liu He, who was vice premier and who was the chair of the financial stability kind of committee. He was also Xi Jinping's top economic advisor on the US-China trade war. So important for things outside of Bitcoin. So he said that Bitcoin mining was harmful for the whole of society and proposed actually a number of national level regulations. What really happened is the provinces and administrative territories and regions looked at that and said, uh-oh. So in China, basically the way it works is like, there's a lot of really strong incentives for local governments to accept Bitcoin mining because they have a lot of stranded electricity. Bitcoin always goes to, like, Bitcoin miners aren't doing it for fun. Yeah. They're not, you know, and especially in the case of China, I can tell you that there's a lot of Bitcoin miners who are not in it for the ideology. They really are in it because it makes money. Just like we talked about, Chinese people care a lot these days about making money. The thing with that, though, is like they're going to China because the power is cheap. Well, why is the power cheap? Well, because you have all these stranded electricity. Some of that is Mao's fault, by the way. He just had this fetish for building hydroelectricity dams everywhere. So you have all this electricity capacity. But also China has built the most electricity in the world. But the markets for it are very inefficient, and Bitcoin can play a role in that. Because, you know, if you have a hydroelectricity dam, it's stranded. What are you going to do with it? Yeah. You know, if you're a local authority, you can sell it to someone and they're paying you money and they're paying you tax revenue. Then why not? But the problem is that the national government stepped in and said, we don't like this. And so every province kind of made a show. I don't want to say made a show. They put in some real policies that were like, hey, like we don't want Bitcoin miners around. And the Chinese central government did arrest a city secretary, Fuzhou, actually where I'm from, because he kept on encouraging Bitcoin mining even after this statement. So the tension has always been that the local governments really want, local governments, and there's also private power companies in China, they love Bitcoin miners.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, and the other thing is there's a lot of pressure put on them actually by Xi Jinping. Because Xi Jinping goes to all of them and says, look, your number one task is poverty elevation. Well, how am I supposed to elevate poverty if I have no money?
Yeah.
So right now what's happening in China, so this is one of these things I'm trying to actively research. And it's been pretty hard because people don't necessarily want to be on the record or things like that. So some of this stuff is not cemented in stone. And I don't want to name like sources. But I'll say in general, from what I've gotten, there are people who left. The people who left, it's because the provinces, they put in like kind of scary sounding things. So like, for example, Inner Mongolia was one province that had quite a bit of Bitcoin mining. And they actually put in a policy where they had like a tip line, a hotline where like people could snitch on other people for mining Bitcoin. So some Bitcoin miners got scared about that, or not scared, well, justifiably so, worried that the policy was turning against them, and so they left. They went to Kazakhstan, the States, or like wherever. A lot of people talk about like the Cambridge Center, the statistics.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because we see like a V-shaped recovery, like the rate go to 0, 2 months after it's going up again.
So that definitely didn't happen in that way. But what it was like, there definitely was a period of time where people were quiet and trying to figure out what was going on, like how serious the provincial authorities were, you know, how serious local law enforcement would be in order to like tag down these deals, right? And since then, since the national government hasn't really said anything about it, there, I think, is been more...
People are relaxing.
People are more relaxed. So one of the things about the Cambridge methodology, which kind of explained the V methodology, is like they use IP addresses in order to track. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So you put a VPN.
So they use IP addresses to track. So they basically get, the way their methodology works is they get the mining pools. They work with like, I think it's like 38% of the hash rate or something like that, because they work with Foundry, like a couple of others. I don't remember the exact ones. But they get the IP addresses, and then from that, they infer. But now there's a very strong incentive, especially with the regulations, to not show that you're mining from a Chinese IP address. But the problem is like, you can still be detected because like you also don't want to use a proxy that's like, in a way that like delays your ability to be able to like, you know, confirm blocks and things like that, right? So they switched the methodology. I never was able to get onto an interview to describe exactly, but some of that V-shape is a combination of two things. One is people did actually leave or quiet. That definitely did happen. It wasn't like 100%, but that definitely did happen, that there was less activity for a certain period, and then it kind of ramped back up because people kind of like shut down their miners, or they were in another place, they were trying to see what was going on. But then the other thing, it was just like the way of tracking, you know, the IP addresses from China was different, and then Cambridge had to do their method, and that explains why it seems to have gone like this, because I think the V-shape, I never got them to confirm it with me, but I think that V-shape is just like they changed the methodology to be like, okay, well, these miners are probably from China. Just like today when people talk to me, you know, they're always like, wow, there's this like mystery force that buys so much Bitcoin and Tether from our exchange. We're going to call them Iceland or Antarctica or country X. Well, no, I mean, put on your thinking hats. It's China, right? Like, I mean, what other place, right? So same thing, I think. It's just like they just finally realized how that proxy is.
So do you think it's China government or Chinese people inside China buying Bitcoin?
I think there are local governments. So one really interesting report, it wasn't me, but Daniel Batten came out with a report on Bitcoin, awesome. On Bitcoin mining. Yeah, I love him.
Love his work.
I love his work. I'm not 100% sure of his knowledge of Chinese policymaking.
Oh,
but he put together that article. But one of the things he did, which I think was the most helpful, is he got 3 people, even though they were anonymous, to say on the record that the way they were doing this was because local government officials were encouraging them to. So it's kind of like what I mentioned to you. So my current run of state, I had a few sources say that in Xinjiang, even though there were regulations, for some reason they never really shut down Bitcoin mining, or the Bitcoin miners are still operating there. They never shut down. I've heard reports from people that people are openly selling ASIC miners in Shenzhen. There's like this storefront that just says ASIC miner. I've heard, Daniel Ban's report, I think was a great, like on the record indication of this, where it's local government officials encouraging people to, solve energy problems. So it's kind of what I just said, right? Like if you want to generate state revenue, there's probably these like, I would guess, this is an educated guess, and I'm not trying to get anyone into trouble, but I would guess that they're signing these kind of informal deals with local authorities. The local authorities also have control over the local law enforcement. And so if you're working with the local authorities, I feel like there's some under the table deals. We know there was at least one senior Communist Party official who was arrested for still encouraging deals like this. And we know recently there's been a few people who have said local government officials are encouraging us to mine Bitcoin to solve energy problems, or they just said government officials. So I think local government officials are encouraged. Well, I don't know who has the Bitcoin at the end of the day.
But I would say it's not only local government, because that is my educated guess from a Brazilian that try to understand things, but I am far, far away, right?
Yeah.
But Hong Kong has an ETF for now. And I guess, as a Brazilian, I would imagine that it wouldn't be approved if the Chinese party, the Communist Party, didn't approve it.
Yeah, that's been something that people have asked me.
Very weird for me.
People have asked me about this. The answer I give people is, I think Hong Kong is an experimental area. They are trying to get, so the ETFs are really tightly regulated. So each custodian and sub-custodian of funds is regulated by Hong Kong's new kind of like exchange licensure, right? The thing with Hong Kong, though, is like, I'm not sure Bitcoin still passes above the line from a national state policy perspective. What I mean by that is people have asked me, like China watchers and stuff like that, they've been like, well, do you think Bitcoin would be a reason for China to remove the Hong Kong dollar peg or things like that, right? And I'm like, in my mind, you're kind of citing the baby. No, you're citing the bathwater and not the baby.
Right.
So China cares about a lot of things. I don't know that Bitcoin policy specific. So to give you an example of this, like for capital controls, there was a study that said maybe $4 to $5 billion was passed through Bitcoin. But there's $100 billion a year based off of misreported travel vouchers that are meant to evade Chinese capital controls, right? So it's just, I don't know that even when the national government commented in 2021, that was not like Xi Jinping.
And it was not a top priority.
It wasn't really like, it was Liu He saying like, hey, this is probably a bad thing. We should act accordingly. There, obviously, the People's Bank of China is very strong on like, we need to get the digital yuan out. We're countering the Bitcoin. So people ask me, well, like Hong Kong, this couldn't have happened without the central authorities. And my kind of answer to that is like, in order for China to change the things about Hong Kong to make these not happen, probably would take more steps than just like how much they care about right now. And so specifically in Hong Kong, it still is quote unquote one country, two systems. It still is a little bit separate from the Chinese system.
Is it? Because here in Brazil, I'm not well informed, but I try to take a close look what it happened in the world. And last election in Hong Kong, supposedly that changed, and you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I wrote about the Hong Kong protests. So, okay, this is very important to say that Hong Kong is becoming more like China.
Yeah.
They arrested, it's called the Hong Kong 47. They arrested Jimmy Lai, who was the owner of Apple Daily. In Hong Kong now, free speech and elections are very much basically there used to be an entire faction of the Hong Kong government that was aiming to be more democratic and that faction has either resigned, some of them are in jail. So this is very real. There used to be Tiananmen Square vigils in Victoria Park that used to be hundreds of thousands of people. They've effectively banned those now with the arrest of leaders of the organization. So don't get me wrong, but at least when it comes to like the technocratic things, like for example, like how Hong Kong regulates securities, right? So China, the central authorities are forcing Hong Kong to, they are forcing Hong Kong to embrace the ECNY. I believe there's more like integration with the digital yuan. I don't think they have a strong enough opinion to make Bitcoin illegal. So what China did with the Hong Kong protests is they saw the protest as an existential threat.
Right.
They saw like, oh, we can't have people advocating for quote unquote Hong Kong independence. And so they moved past a national security law through the back door to stop that. That was a central Chinese state priority.
Okay, so they don't try to push that much control because you get a pushback from people, so they just push in existential threat.
Well, they might still. Don't trust me. Don't get me wrong. Like the fact that the central authorities have taken more over from the local authorities. I mean, overall, you can never quite predict that. But I think there are some strong reasons for why China would not. And the first is that now Hong Kong is bruised and battered. China is looking for more foreign direct investment. And Hong Kong has always been that kind of accepted pathway. So when I went back to Hong Kong, one of the first things I saw that was kind of really funny is they had this Forbes magazine, and the Hong Kong government put in a 2-page advert that said, "Don't pay attention to the protests. We are still open for business. We want your money," right? So I think there's that part. It would be very stupid of the Chinese central authorities right now. It's also why they're like, they made travel visa free for a lot of European countries. I think maybe even Brazil. I'm not too sure. But they're trying to get more tourists. They're trying to get more people to spend money in the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is doing very poorly right now. Yeah. So there's that reason. And then the second reason is so don't get me wrong. The Chinese government showed that it could contravene any law in Hong Kong if it wanted to. It could supplement it. We saw that with the national security law. In that respect, I think Hong Kong has become more like China in the sense of Hong Kong was once regarded as a rule of law society. I think you can't really say that as much anymore. But, when it comes to the technocratic elements, think about it this way. Let's say Trump, or I'm going to make a Brazilian example of the little I know of Brazilian geopolitics. Lula takes power, right? There are still some things that he can't control as president. Right? There are just these things written in. So, for example, Trump can't control how the Fed operates, right? Same thing.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, yes. There are ways that he can appoint, a chairman and all these other things. But it's meant to have that separation of those levels, right? So, same thing with Hong Kong. It's it's not important enough in an issue for China to change things about Hong Kong, because they would have to change the basic law. They would have to change the constitution of Hong Kong in order to stop Bitcoin. What they did do is they made it illegal for Chinese people in the mainland to buy the Bitcoin spot ETF.
So people in mainland cannot access...
Can't buy it. No.
Oh, okay.
Correct. Yeah. So they did make it illegal for China. So they are still creating that firewall. But if they would have banned the transaction of Bitcoin, there's 2 articles in Hong Kong law and the basic law, Article 112 and Article 115. These basically say that Hong Kong dollar can't be restricted from trade. It's essentially a way of enforcing no capital controls and no ability to force Hong Kong people not to be able to exchange their Hong Kong dollars for any commodity or anything else. So if that disappears, that's the baby. That's China saying we no longer want Hong Kong to transact freely. We want Hong Kong to be under capital controls. I don't think they would do that. Then as a result, Bitcoin would probably, but I just don't think the Chinese authorities think about the bathwater with the baby. They don't think about the reverse. They're not Bitcoin is such an existential issue to our survival that we have to change how Hong Kong operates.
Right.
That would be
too much friction for a small problem.
For what they regard as a small problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. But I will say Hong Kong is an interesting lens to counter views because, for example, a Hong Kong professor wrote a recent editorial that said the Bitcoin mining ban in China was a very big mistake. And what happened was all the miners left to the United States, and now they're generating billions of dollars of tax revenue for the Americans, our biggest ideological rival. If you have such a big problem with Bitcoin mining, use state-owned enterprises to mine them. Those are under the control of the party. So exactly saying kind of what you said, like why can't the national government just but I think that those views were published in Hong Kong. It would be harder to publish them in the mainland, not impossible. I don't think that is what is actually happening right now. Certainly there is no public proclamation of it. I think that there are deals with local governments, knowing how Bitcoin miners typically think. They're very fiat based. And I have a couple of public quotes, like one OG Bitcoin miner was like, yeah, I think the digital yuan will win because, they're not, because, more people will embrace the digital yuan. My point being that Bitcoin miners can be more fiat focused, right?
I used to work in a Bitcoin mining company in Brazil, and I understand of we tend to imagine that, because this person is working in Bitcoin mining, he has the ideology of a Bitcoiner. Yeah. And it's just not true. It can be true, but it's the exception, it's not the rule.
Yeah, exactly. So, now you have a lot of people who are doing the mining, or who are assumably still doing mining in China. The interesting question is kind of like, where does that Bitcoin go, right? Who's holding on to that? And how are the payments being made, right? Like in my mind, I think most of these are probably fiat for power. And then the people are selling Bitcoin through over-the-counter trading desks or different ways. Also exchanges, we didn't really cover this as much, but exchanges are essentially banned in China as well. But there are ways to buy and sell Bitcoin for sure. One of the things with the Hong Kong ETF, just to tie that all together, that was trumpeted was that they had in-kind redemptions. Because there is still an outstanding problem, which is of the Bitcoin that was mined in China, where is that now? And the truthful answer is, I think, no one really knows, right? It could be on steel plates somewhere, someone's house. Even the Chinese Communist Party is well, it's very hard for us to understand with Bitcoin, who really holds it, right?
Yeah.
So if you have the miners, the idea of the Hong Kong ETFs were that, that some of these mainland Chinese people might do in-kind redemptions. They might send their Bitcoin and then have it be certified in the Hong Kong ETF. But I think we've seen very little of that in practice. The Hong Kong ETF inflows have been very small.
I think people would be smarter than that, right?
But that's exactly the thing. If you think from the perspective of a traditional, let's say, I'm just going to name Fred Krueger ETF type, you would think in that way. But if you think in a cypherpunk way, you would think the opposite. And if you think a Chinese person would, it's I already have my money outside of the system.
Exactly.
Why would I put it back into a...
I mean, Freddy Krueger would think like that because he spent all his life in America, that there is the rule of law, and he can trust a little bit, but he can trust this government. Right. I mean, Brazilians don't have this luxury. I think Chinese don't have this luxury as well. So
Exactly. Yeah. So Chinese people don't have that luxury, and I think that explains. And it explains now, because people ask me does China still have a role to play in Bitcoin? And you're seeing, I just talked with Chain Analysis about this. You're seeing that there's more and more inflows of China-based OTC. So more Chinese people are buying Bitcoin. It's almost at all-time highs now, I think, from what I can see, based off the information we have. Now, we have very few quantitative answers because there's no public trading pairs available. But from all the information I've gathered, Chinese people seem to be buying more and more Bitcoin. Certainly more than 2021, there was a lot less activity, and now it seems to be going back up. And it certainly seems like there's a lot more interest in participating in the ecosystem. This might surprise people, but there are Chinese Bitcoin VCs
Whoa.
and there are developers.
And they invest in
entrepreneurs.
China or they invest outside China?
They invest in China because nothing says that, like, it's very specific, like the regulations. Like the regulations are very specific to like what the risk is. The risk is if you're trying to buy Bitcoin with yuan, and if you're trying to sell Bitcoin for yuan, that's kind of where the risk is, right? But nothing in there says that you can't invest in companies. It's like discouraged,
Right.
you know, but it's not illegal per se. And that's why, like, you know, there are also people who work in Bitcoin companies who still are developers, and there's a lot of Bitcoin education resources available, like in the Chinese internet and stuff like that.
Oh, I would never guess that. I would think by like, okay, China is a strong country that tries to control information. That's why Baidu is not Google, for instance.
Yeah.
So how come would they keep like content that educate people for a freedom tech?
Yeah, I mean they ban like so what they've been most concerned about is they're concerned about capital flight, and they're concerned about capital instability. So a lot of China's history, so for example, when they banned ICOs, it was during 2015, 2016. And just a short history for your listeners, in 2015, 2016, the Chinese stock market crashed. But it was a very, very interesting crash because there was a lot of retail investors. We call them in China jiucai, which means chives. I don't know what the Brazilian term is, but you know, in the States, they're always like dumping on retail or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So the Chinese stock market is really interesting because there's not a lot of institutional players. In the United States, there's a lot of like large players that are buyers and sellers that go back and forth, right? You can think of like the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans of the world. In China, a lot of the buyers and sellers of what are called AGU, which is like company domestic shares, are retail. And so they had the ability to create like incredible bubbles, incredible, you know, so that's the stuff that China's been focused on. So they'll ban exchanges, they'll ban like financial information, they ban stuff like CoinMarketCap and like CoinGecko, right? Like that kind of stuff. But no, you can go on like a bunch of Chinese, there's like a Chinese Wikipedia, and that has like resources on Bitcoin. Now, it's not like necessarily super positive about Bitcoin. There are technical resources. I mean, some of them are hosted on GitHub in order to avoid censorship. I definitely have heard that, you know, conversations about Bitcoin are sensitive. So I'm not trying to underrate that. But what I would say is that like the risk is like very, very specific. Even in China, like technically it's illegal to run a VPN, but you have to understand like the risk. And I think maybe, and you can tell me about that, maybe Brazilians saw a little bit of that in terms of the enforcement. But it's very hard to enforce on like an individual. What you can do is like what China does, is you go after the big players. You go out, so you don't go after. I mean, yeah, you can go after one or two people who use VPNs to make an example of them. But if you do that to too many people, it's just ridiculous. The whole country, like, there's not enough jail cells for like the number of people, right? Especially in China, like I don't even know how many, but like it must be millions of people use VPNs, right? So the risk there is more if you're running a VPN company. So if you're in China, if you're running like an over-the-counter trading that's focused on selling Bitcoin or Tether for yuan, yeah, you are taking on quite a bit of risk, especially if you're being loud about that, right? But if you're working for a Bitcoin company, if you're trying to learn more about Bitcoin from a technical perspective, I don't think they have any issues with that. And in fact, the Chinese government has said, since Trump has talked so much about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, a former vice minister of finance has said, yeah, we should study this more.
That was my next question, to be honest. Like, okay, now Trump just won the presidency again.
What a crazy time we live in.
Yeah, and he told out loud that America would have a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Mm-hmm.
And he has more 3 months until he starts in office.
Yeah.
I mean, game theory. What China is going to do, what Russia is going to do. I mean, if your competitor is going to start buying Bitcoin, they want to buy 1 million coins in the next 4 or 5 years. What China is going to do? What do you think?
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing that's happening now with the United States, and you know, with Trump's recent election, the strategic Bitcoin reserve. So the first thing I always tell people is like China is kind of on a stuck policy path. The Chinese Communist Party has the luxury of not having to face elections. So typically when they have plans, especially technocratic plans, these are like long cycle things. Like I just mentioned to you that they've been trying to change the central bank to be more interest rate oriented, shorthand for more markets oriented. That's been a plan that's been set. Xi Jinping has said certain things that has accelerated that plan. So sometimes if you get a good word in from Xi, it helps to change the policy in a very technocratic area. But in general, these are things that have been thought of for like a 5-10 year span. Like China's been doing research on the Digital Currency Research Institute for the digital yuan since 2014, right? Like these are things that are set. And so unless Xi Jinping has a personal turn of heart. So the first assumption is that Xi Jinping is going to be in power until 2029. Most likely going to be the case. People ask me back and forth. I always say, look at Iran.
Yeah.
If you think a government, trust me, I'm no fan of Iran and the mullahs and everything. But if you think a government's going to fail, Iran has had many more reasons to fail, and it still has not since the Iranian Revolution. China is a much more powerful country, has many more things under its control.
Yeah, natural
foreign
resources.
Reserves, not necessarily natural resources, but foreign reserves, manufacturing capacity. It is the manufacturer primo of the world still, right? So, yeah, the natural reserves part actually less so. China's
not oil, but I mean energy, rivers,
electricity. Yes, that was actually going to be in part of my answer. But for example, China's a net food importer. China's a net commodity importer. China's
more than 1 billion people. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So there is definitely China generates a lot of electricity for sure, and they've invested a lot into doing that. So the thing with China's reaction now is that like you're not likely to see, so long as Xi is in power, that kind of a dramatic. So first it would take words from him. So It would take a change. I wouldn't even say a change of heart, because Xi does not really comment on Bitcoin that often. But Xi Jinping is very big on blockchain. He thinks it's a foundational technology. It's one of these things that China has to control. So there's all these blockchain patents that have been filed. My book talks about it. China's very proud of the fact that they have filed the most patents about blockchain. What does that mean? I have no idea what any of these applications will do. I read this book about how like there's rural farmers who are using blockchain to track the number of chicken eggs they have. Like, just why don't you just put it on Baidu Cloud or whatever? But anyways, that's So it would take him to step back and say like, hey, I've studied this blockchain thing. I've listened to what the central bank says about the digital yuan. I am now a Bitcoiner. So if someone can orange pill Xi Jinping, it's a little bit above my pay grade. But that's, I think, what it would take. I think it's unlikely. If I were betting, since we're talking about the elections, and I know it's kind of a shit coin, but poly market, since we're all in there, I think it's like like I would put a bet in at like 10% odds.
Right.
It's very unlikely. But I will say that you are going to probably see a lot of positive headlines coming from China. So even if there's not meaningful policy shifts, there's not likely going to be. So right now in China, the economy is doing really, really badly, and so as a result of that, they're printing more stimulus, and also they are looking to give local governments more leeway, because the local governments haven't raised as much tax, because the property bubble you mentioned, the local governments in China derive most of their revenue from property taxes, or from the way they do property sales. But anyways, this has created a situation where like that is the existential thing that they're facing up to. If Hong Kong can use Bitcoin to like attract FDI flows, I don't think the Chinese government will mind. I don't think the central government will mind. They have much bigger problems to deal with now, right? With the property bubbles, and with the fact the property bubble is going to be existential for China. The thing is, if shares in China go down, it sucks, and they have been going down. Some people I've talked to, their portfolios are down 60, 70%. If they're in Chinese shares, it's like absolutely bloodbath. But if housing goes down, that's how the Chinese middle class has really created their wealth. And the Chinese property developers, they kind of work like a Ponzi scheme. Like you put down money for pre-start construction, and then you pay off a mortgage. So if you don't get delivered the housing units, and if the property developer fails, then that's like a very obvious cause for riots.
And they are already failing, right? I don't remember the name
Evergrande,
of the company.
like exactly. A couple. Evergrande is a little bit more technical, but they had like a technical default and all this other stuff. So, but yeah, in general, like if you have a lot of these, that's when you start seeing social unrest. Because if shares go down, and they have already been going down anyways, like it's mostly foreign investors and then like some richer people who have money to play with that are affected. It sucks. It's bad. Don't get me wrong. But if housing is crashed and people aren't delivered the housing units they were promised by the developers, they have done this already. They're gonna gather and riot, because it's like, I don't have, it's like this is just a straight Ponzi scheme. I was promised something and then I don't have it, and it's a very tangible thing to like rally around. So I just think that the Chinese government's gonna have a lot of problems to deal with. So the stimulus stuff is going to be bullish for Bitcoin, because it's gonna be more monetary easing. It's probably going to lead more Chinese people to go and look for solutions. Because right now in China, there's like very few options for you to get return. There might be a short-term effect where, because the stimulus is happening, Chinese shares are recovering a bit. But fundamentally, like Chinese property prices are not going to, I think that's a more fundamental issue. Having talked with a few people who are based in China, like some people think it's going to be like the 1980s in Japan. You're looking at maybe like a lost decade. If that's the case, then certainly, Chinese shares may not recover for a very, very long time. But the world is still going on outside, right? So it'll give, I think, Chinese people more appeal to look at Bitcoin and things like that. We're already seeing record inflows. You're probably going to see more. The other thing, too, is because Trump got elected, the people in the policy, including maybe Xi Jinping, have to study more closely. So the Chinese party state's number one priority is always to study what the US president does. Of course, they're going to be dealing with Trump in the sense of like he's going to have tariffs and things like that. But one of the things I noticed was after he visited PubKey, that's when the vice minister of finance mentioned like, oh, Trump talks a lot about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, right? I wonder if like we should be studying that more. You're going to see more and more of that, because just as an osmosis of like Trump being there and like the strategic Bitcoin reserve and all this other stuff, like that's going to pop in as like, oh, is that like kind of a thing that we should study more closely? So you're going to see positive headlines, I think, from China in that sense. But it would surprise me a lot if the policy actually really changed, if like state-owned enterprises would, mine Bitcoin. You're seeing Russia actually take the opposite tact. Like they are now mining Bitcoin in places. Yeah. And then, I think the beginning of it, and Samson talks a lot about this, like in order to orange pill nations, you start with them doing the mining, right? So Ethiopia or Bhutan or something like that. Then you're like, well, you already have all the Bitcoin, so why don't you just hold the Bitcoin? Because the Bitcoin is appreciating. You can see that go on and on. So then you have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? So you're basically churning countries with like electricity surplus and energy surpluses. So Russia, in this example, what Russia is really doing, I think, in my opinion, is they've been struggling a lot to try to sell their energy surplus into a currency that other people will accept, right? So they've tried to sell oil and gold. They've tried to do all kinds of things, right? So I think to me, it makes a lot of sense to just be like, well, then why don't we just convert our energy surplus into Bitcoin?
Monetize wasted energy. Yeah.
Monetize wasted energy in Bitcoin. You're right that the exact same argument should apply to the Chinese nation state. There have been people like that Hong Kong professor I mentioned who have made that argument. They've been like, why don't you just use the state-owned enterprises and mine Bitcoin? We have all the computing chips. We have all these other things. We have all this electricity that's stranded. We're the most stranded electricity in the world, probably. Why not monetize that? And I think China, I think there's two things there between why they're not doing that like Russia is. One is that China is still more accepted in the Chinese, in the world kind of financial system. They're not like directly sanctioned. I mean, the Biden administration had threatened to do secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that still interacted with the Russian system. But the Russian system is essentially like cut off. Yeah. So China doesn't face the same, like, to a certain degree, American companies have left China, right? So in that sense, there's like a little bit less foreign direct investment, but it's not to the degree of a Russia. So I don't think they're as rushed to, for Russia, they're like completely cut off. It's almost like existential for them. Yeah. So that's why I think China will not necessarily act in the same way. And the second is that like China, they have this concept called high quality development, and Xi is very big on this whole like green growth or green energy or just like green overall. So even all this electricity they're producing, it's like they're trying to portray this narrative of like we're trying to go net zero by like 2060 or 2070 or whatever it is. So I don't think that fits. Like Bitcoin mining just doesn't fit that narrative because they spent so much time talking about how Bitcoin mining is a waste of energy, and until they like basically it would just take Xi changing heart on a number of different topics. But under the current framework of China, it's just like not set up. It's set up to be more of an argument for other countries to do what they've been doing, which is like create their own central bank digital currency in order to enforce monetary policy. Unlike other central banks, China's central bank reports directly to the state. There is no separation between central bank and state. I don't really know how it works in Brazil, but I'm assuming it's somewhat similar to like the Fed or whatever. They're like nominally independent. I have no idea.
Theoretically. True. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, in the case of China, it's not even just theoretically. Like they are subordinated. Like they report directly to the state council. So there isn't even the illusion that they don't, right? So I think they're trying to create like this model. The central bank really wants, to create a tailored system of control. One of the things I think that might happen that's kind of interesting is they've been laying off the capital controls, but potentially because they'll have more programmable digital money under their own control, or even with WeChat Pay, Alipay, directly, these are kind of private competitors to digital yuan, the main digital way of paying for most Chinese people, similar to an Apple Pay or an Android Pay or Google Pay. So these kind of ways of interfacing I think are going to allow the Chinese party state to enforce more control, not only from a political but economic sense. Imagine a system that is able to track people's consumption and spend, is able to expire people's money, which they did in the trials, right? I think that's what China's trying to do, try to be an exemplar for that. And you see like countries like India, who are ideological rivals to China, but they have very similar thoughts. Replace the cash, demonetize, use and develop the digital rupee. It doesn't matter that the two governments are at loggerheads. It's what the government, you know what I'm saying? It's like a state capacity, state ideology. It's like if you control the state, how do you maximize your power and your control? So I think that's where China's going more into. They've derided Bitcoin as like a joke. One Chinese state economist said that like if we adopted Bitcoin economics, everybody would die, like literally. So like, yeah, I think it'll be hard to kind of get back from there. But again, putting out an open call. If any of you, maybe it's like Matt Odell or something. Xi Jinping's just chilling out, grabbing some Mao Tai, and he's just like, why don't I crack open? Because Trump's been talking about Bitcoin so often, in between him threatening me with tariffs. So like, why don't I just crack open some Mao Tai and then just kind of listen to the latest Saifedean podcast or something? I don't know.
You talk about India, China, and Saifedean. It's impossible for me not to remember the Bitcoin standard when Saifedean make the argument that China and India made a choice in the last century, 2 centuries ago, in the 18th something, and they choose to use silver instead of gold, and that made both of them poor in the next 100 years. Mm-hmm. And what you are talking now, it's exactly the same mistake all over again.
Yeah, I think it's the same mistake. But like, I mean, obviously I think that. I'm nowhere near Chinese policy circles. So I think Chinese policymakers, to the extent that, and this is like kind of like an art in of itself, like how do you read the tea leaves, they call it, like what's going on with China. I think they don't think the same way. I think it's a grave mistake. I've made the point. And the thing that I tell American policymakers, to the extent I have contact with them, and there's some people, I do have, not like contacts, but some people that have worked with like Chinese state media that are pretty pro-Bitcoin. It's kind of also an interesting thing. The thing I always reinforce is like, you're just giving the Americans, I mean, they are just giving the Americans a free card. The Bitcoin miners that have come in, most of them now are public corps. They pay tax revenue. They employ Americans. They're like, taking advantage of stranded resources, flared gas and other different things. They're turning waste into productive monetary capacity, right? Why don't you do that as well? But I think there's a very staunch ideological reasons. Like first, you would have to actually not even have to first orange pill Xi. You would have to, like Saifuddin in the Bitcoin Standard, it's very much an Austrian point of view of the world. You would have to convince Xi Jinping, who has built his life on expanding state capacity, the responsibility of the party. You'd almost have to convince him that everything he did was wrong. I think that's kind of like, maybe forget about the Bitcoin part about that. That's almost like kind of like the harder obstacle. Would Xi hold Bitcoin? I think reluctantly, maybe if push came to shove and it was the only way to transact, yes. But we still live in a world where, even like most of Chinese people now, when they use Bitcoin, it's mostly through Tether. So there's like kind of interfacing with the US dollar system more than anything else. I can't even say they use Bitcoin, they use Tether.
Yeah, I would bet that Xi and Mao would hold Bitcoin because I look to Russia, and Putin would hold Bitcoin. He is using Gazprom to mine Bitcoin. Yeah. What he doesn't want is that the population use Bitcoin, but it's different, the interest of the party and the interest of the population.
Yeah.
So I would guess that Xi and Mao would hold Bitcoin for the party, for themselves, and would try to forbid the population to use it. That would be my take.
Yeah, eventually, if it got to that, I mean, basically what China would look for, so the digital yuan they're using, so the thing about China is like China is very, very dependent on imports, food imports, and commodity imports specifically. If a lot of their partners refuse to accept the yuan for any number of reasons, then yeah, I think they would eventually look at Bitcoin, similar to how Putin's looking at it. I like that nuance. I definitely think Xi would not want, and the Chinese Party state has taken a lot of steps to prevent people from using Bitcoin for capital flight, all these other different reasons we discussed. Corruption as well, that also is something that the Chinese Party state worries about. It's like, are people exiting funds because they're, obviously the Chinese definition of corruption is kind of its own different rabbit hole that we can talk about. But whether Xi would hold it in the capacity of the Chinese state, I don't think Xi, like based off our earlier discussion, I don't think Xi would be like Mao in the sense of like, oh, like Bitcoin is like inherently this like very evil ideological thing and we have to absolutely refuse it. So I think in that sense, it could be more like a Dengist approach. Like if push came to shove and the Chinese state needed Bitcoin, I don't think Xi would hesitate to go in that direction, similar to how he thinks about markets, right? Like from a socialism perspective, they still think about markets in a very contradictory way, but they're aware that like the markets are a tool, right? And so if you're trying to like recover the economy, you want to loosen up restrictions. Similar to that, if you want to transact internationally, maybe there comes a day where China needs to use Bitcoin. So maybe in that case, Xi or whoever succeeds him, which will also be a really interesting question, might start looking into that. I think in order for that to happen, if I'm playing out the game theory now as more like a Bitcoiner, you need like major countries. So I think the most likely path would be if there was a block of countries that suddenly preferred accepting Bitcoin for food. So one geopolitical tension, basically what it is that China has the United States, has a gun to the United States face in the sense of all the manufacturing. So if you shut down Chinese manufacturing today, a lot of essential like medications and everything like that just would not flow to the United States anymore. And it would take a while for them to create that capacity again. I have to go back to this, but just thinking about Bitcoin miners, a lot of Bitcoin miners, because of the tariffs, have moved their manufacturing from outside of China to countries around it. So that will make it more difficult for China if it does go on this very, very hypothetical path we took on, because they're being affected by the tariffs and manufacturing is kind of moving out anyways. So if that happens again with the Trump administration, I think you're going to see more and more movement of that. But similarly, the United States and the Western Bloc, and actually Brazil is an important part of this, and Argentina have, I would say, a gun to China's face, and that is food. It's existential for China, given China's history, to never have starvation again and the famines, because famines have killed so many people in China. We talked about Mao, and the greatest man-made famine in world history happened under Mao's watch. Millions and millions of people died. If that were to happen again, that would be existential to the Chinese Communist Party's survival. And now you have me riffing on a very, very long situation, really long hypothetical, but maybe this is kind of like something for your listeners to gloss over. You know, I talked about as early as 2019 or 2018 this idea of a Cairns group. So the Cairns group is kind of like all the countries that sell wheat in the world, and they kind of come together. It's like OPEC, but for wheat. So far, what I've seen is that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they have accepted digital yuan for oil. And they have actually been part of China's pilot project called Project Enbridge between different central bank digital currencies. So the other existential thing is China imports a lot of commodities and oil, but I think it will find its way to settle oil through the Middle Eastern partners. And then I think for commodities, that's like so diversified that it will always find like different ways. Like, for example, Afghanistan has like a ton of like raw materials, and China's just willing to work with the Taliban and nobody else really is, right? Like, but food, there's actually like a concentration of food producing nations, like the Cairns group. And eventually it may make sense for a bunch of them to monetize in Bitcoin, because a bunch of them also have problems with like inflation in their domestic currency. So I'm thinking about Brazil, Argentina, and like a couple of other places, right? And if the United States embraces Bitcoin, and if Argentina embraces Bitcoin under a Malay, let's say, and let's say Brazil, hypothetically, I guess not under Lula, but maybe under someone else.
Let's hope. I don't see any potential in our future, in our political system. Maybe a new guy, but I'm not sure.
But those are like 80% of the food importers to China. So right there, you have like, I mean, if that bloc decided we were going to receive money through Bitcoin, I think China would have no, like playing the game theory out, China would not have recourse outside. They have ideological blockers for something that makes economic sense for them. They should be mining Bitcoin, honestly. China should be mining Bitcoin. China should be using all that stranded electricity. They have the most stranded electricity in the world. They should be turning that into a more convertible, digital money that will not inflate. Right now, they're pegging the yuan to like a semi-trading range around the US dollar. That creates its own problems, right? Fiat on top of fiat. But they won't for ideological reasons. And I don't think those ideological reasons are going to change anytime soon. If any of you people manage to orange pill Xi Jinping, I guarantee you have, like,
you change the world.
Yeah, you change the world. It's not going to be me. I'm way above my pay grade. Yeah. But, but I think in the situation of like, again, like if it's existential to China, and I think food imports is probably the thing I can think of right now, that would probably conceivably have, because even as early as that time, I was writing that like it probably makes sense for the Cairns group to accept Bitcoin. And a lot of the countries that were, Ukraine was thinking about it before the war, and other things like that. They were thinking about becoming more accepting of Bitcoin and different things. So maybe that becomes a reality.
Perfect. Man, I think we are talking about what, 1 hour, 1.5 hours?
1 and 4.
1 and 4. So did we leave something behind that we should have talked about it?
I don't know, man. I mean, you got. Well, I guess I'm thinking about like specifically out of all the stuff we talked about. If there's something like specific to Brazil, maybe, or I don't know. Is there?
I think maybe about, I don't know, how you see the future of Bitcoin in China. I don't know, because I mean, for us in Brazil, it's so rare to have the opportunity to talk to someone that understands more about China and the interface with Bitcoin, that look to Brazil now, it's a waste, let's be honest.
Okay.
So I don't know, are anything that we didn't talk about that you think it would be enriching for us Brazilians to know about China and Bitcoin?
I guess like one thing I sometimes talk about, which is helpful, is because I think a lot of Brazilians probably have the same thing as maybe Europeans or Americans when they're trying to buy Bitcoin. They might think, why didn't the government ban it? or like I've heard that before from some Europeans and some Americans, and so I always bring up the example of China as like China is like kind of like in cybersecurity. There's this thing called blue team and red team. The idea is like you have a red team that goes and just like messes all your shit up and just like is trying to find all the vulnerabilities, all the holes in your defenses, right? China's that for Bitcoin. China's, and I will say this about China, like there's that meme on Twitter, like, no, you do not have to give them credit. But like, China does understand new technologies fairly well.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I talked to Will from Damus for my book. And not only did they ban Damus from the App Store pretty early on, they started banning the default relays. This to me shows like within like a week or 2 weeks, they really understood the tech. Like they had someone at the Great Firewall actually understand the technology well enough to be able to kind of ban it, or not ban it, but like to block it or make it much more difficult. Even the way that they dealt with Bitcoin, they realized that like most people use exchanges. So if you shut down the exchanges, yeah, you can never stop Bitcoin, but you make it a lot more difficult. So China to me is like a red team, and it shows two things. One, it shows other countries what it would look like for a country to ban Bitcoin. So if you read about how the Chinese government justifies, if you start seeing the same arguments, it's like, oh, the environment, it's like waste and things like that. These are things that all governments are trying to deploy. I assume in Brazil, there's some version of this argument as well. And so it's things to look for, right? Why they banned ICOs. They banned ICOs because they were saying Chinese people were too irresponsible. This was like illegal financing. Everything is a Ponzi scheme. That's not such a dissimilar argument to how the Americans regulate. That's not such a dissimilar argument to how people think about investor protections, right? So understanding that is so important to understanding how a country might quote unquote ban Bitcoin. The other thing to understand is really like the red team aspect. Like China had almost the majority of the world's hash rate, or at many times above the world's hash rate majority, like 50% plus, might have been geographically based in China. It's kind of impossible to tell because, everybody, the pools themselves don't really publicly report IP addresses, blah, blah, blah. But even with that, even with those miners getting kicked out, Bitcoin recovered within a few weeks. And now we're at all-time hashing rates, all-time mining difficulty. Just the way the network is architected is robust enough to survive a pretty smart state, got to give them credit there, that put a lot of really deep attacks. And so understanding that, I have an article on my website, ChinaBitcoinBook.com, which goes into a little bit more detail. But it goes into really like, okay, well, you heard China bans Bitcoin this, China bans Bitcoin that. What does that mean? Well, first, you can't really ban Bitcoin. Nobody can really stop you going peer-to-peer. And that still happens in China. I mean, I don't know how often it happens, but some people still do transact in that way. But what you can do is you can make things really difficult. And China has tried this and that, and Bitcoin still persevered because Bitcoin is designed to be anti-fragile. But understanding that is really understanding why self-custody matters, why these different things matters. So for example, I've heard some reports that exchanges, and actually the Chinese police authorities say sometimes in their arrests, they collaborate with certain exchanges. I'm not going to name any specific exchanges because, but they do collaborate with some exchanges, right? So if you're Chinese and you know that, you have to understand that your funds can be frozen if it's on an exchange. This is the difference between custody and self-custody. We talk about it in the West, in the United States and Canada, but it's very, very hypothetical. And if there's one thing I hope your audience can take from this, it's kind of like two things. One is, yes, China is dystopic in its own way, but it does things in a way that other states will follow. And so learning from that example will help understand, you can help understand how states as a whole might fight against Bitcoin, or how some of them might adopt Bitcoin, right? The other head for that is like, because Bitcoin has survived these attacks, it really, for Chinese people, it shows a difference. Like we say these as buzzwords, but once you don't have access, similar to like, I guess when Brazilians first, I don't even know what that period was like, but when X was down, right? Like, of course, if you had to access X, it was no longer a matter of like, oh, maybe if I access X, I have to upload a photo. It's kind of inconvenient. It's like literally you don't have access to the content. And so Chinese people have encountered that for a very long time. And like seeing that in action is really interesting. Having said that, a lot of Chinese people keep their stuff on exchanges. But my point is, by looking at how the state attacks these vectors, understanding that the state can cooperate with exchanges and freeze funds, individual accounts with KYC, is important to understanding how we as Bitcoiners, if we think about China as the red team, should live our Bitcoin lives. Why self-custody is so important, all those other things that feel like buzzwords, but that become so real, especially in different contexts like China. So if I want to leave two things to your audience, one, study China and study what's going on, because China's going to study Bitcoin. And two, like, I hope that they're able to understand, like, interface with Chinese Bitcoiners. I always encourage that. There are people on Nostr. I have a list. I'm giving a presentation at StatsConf. I have a list of NPubs that people can follow. And now you have auto-translate. And the reason why I so encourage that is, A, they're a lonely bunch.
Yeah.
It's very few of them. But it's really cool to see them whenever they're out and about. But B, we can all learn from them, I think, the importance of what it means to have these things that we might think of as buzzwords: self-custody. What does it mean to be censorship resistant? What does it mean that the value will appreciate in the face of the fact that if you save in China, you can only save a certain way and you're restricted from taking money out of the system?
Perfect, man. I think we are done here, man. I cannot think anything more than that, and I think it was awesome, man. Thank you for your time.
I could teach you some Mandarin swear words too. Is that like
no, that's important. That's important as well.
All right, I'll just
teach our audience.
Teach the audience. Yeah, I think some people are not going to be super pleased about this, but